Hey everybody, it's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Welcome to, what is this, a Tuesday afternoon in February. Hope everybody is safe and well, and thank you for being with us. As we come into the room, and we've got a full house today, over 700 people signed up to be with us. We've got room for about 500 in the space, so if you're having a challenge getting in, or a colleague is, we are recording this and we will share this on our YouTube channel just a little bit later on. But if you would, and if you've been with us before, you know this is our practice. Go ahead into the chat. Let's just say hello to one another and be in community. If you would, we practice this two-word check-in. This is an idea that we borrowed from Professor Brene Brown down at the University of Houston. And so those two words, your name, where you're coming in from, those two words, how are you doing right now? And so go ahead and toss that into the chat. You'll see that little chat bubble. We're going to be talking to one another across the next hour. Probably want to make sure that's talking to everyone, or it might say to all panelists and attendees. Hey, Letitia, how are you? Ari, how are you? Let's see who else is with us. Jessica, I'm going to put on my specs, gang, and you're already starting to go fast. Jillian, Pam, Catherine, Paula, Nina, Lori, Lamont, Sully, Kim. Okay, you're going way, way, way too fast for me, but please, lots of folks coming in from all over the place. We are grateful and happy to have you with us. While you're saying hello to one another, I'm also going to take a quick moment and just give a quick shout out to all our friends down in Texas. As y'all know, folks in Texas, in southwestern Louisiana, up there in Oklahoma, and even into parts of Arkansas, have been having a really tough go over the last couple of weeks. I've had the opportunity to check in with a number of our friends from our last network conference down in Austin, Texas. And the good news is everybody is safe, many of them still uncomfortable. And so in a moment or two, our colleague Kareem is going to put in the chat some tools that'll help you if you'd like to offer up a little bit of help and support to all the good folks down there in the southwest and south central part of the United States. We are thinking of them, and for those who might be able to be with us, you've been in our thoughts, and we're hopeful to be helpful if we can be. While we're doing that, my colleague Tristan Mahabir, my partner in crime, is going to toss up some screen for us to follow. Tristan, why don't we run through a little bit of housekeeping as folks are still coming into the room. So first, obviously, you know, this is a network webinar, but let's go ahead to the next slide. This is something I want to just flag for everybody. The Clarence B. Jones Impact Award. This is named after Dr. Jones, who was the speechwriter for Dr. Martin Luther King, who was also the attorney for a number of notable folks, and among them James Baldwin. An incredible communicator in his own right. He helped to write the Dream Speech with Martin Luther King. And for the last couple of years, we have been giving out an award in his name that aims to celebrate communications for good that's really been transformative, that's changed the world. So that emphasis on impact, how comms can help to transform the world. Last couple of years, we've had winners, been fortunate to be able to name folks like the Truth Initiative, that anti-smoking effort, youth anti-smoking effort, the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, led by the incredible Desmond Meade, that was restoring the vote to previously incarcerated people in the state of Florida, and more recently, A Step Ahead Chattanooga, an incredible organization working in Appalachia to try to help destigmatize women's health and reproductive rights. So this year, we are looking to add to that august list of honorees, and so we'll be collecting nominations until the end of April. If you've got an idea of an individual or organization that's just done transformational work, would invite you to go to jonesaward.org, or you can find that through comnetwork.org. And please, we're looking for wonderful nominations so we can highlight another organization, and that winner will give a case study keynote at the next network gathering. Tristan, if you'll take this forward. Another thing just to flag for you, we opened up a listserv last year. This is free and open to everybody. You don't just have to be a network member, but it's just a means of us to be in contact and in community and to problem solve together. So if you are keen to do that, you can find the coordinates right there. I think we'll put them into the chat as well, but welcome you to participate. And as you can just get a flavor of some of the things that we offer up in that listserv, everything from job openings to how do I fill in the blank. And there's always an answer on the other side of this. So grateful to everybody who's been contributing and participating there. Mr. T, if you would, just take us forward. The other thing is, when I talked about the Jones Award, I mentioned we were going to be gathering. We are. Please put this date in your calendar. I'll have more details for you as soon as we know them, but please do know we're doing all good work trying to get ready for this. But October 6th through the 8th, we will gather. Last year we did this virtually. We're still trying to figure out our plans for this year, but be grateful to have you with us if you're able to manage it. And that will be coming up October 6th through 8th. Mr. T, if you would, take us forward. The other thing I want to flag for you, many of you know this already, the network doesn't just gather that once a year. We know that's important, the cross-pollination and all the ideas that we're able to share and the community we're able to build when we're together. But we also know that matters in the communities where you live, which is why there are 16 cities where we have local groups active all around the country. You can find out more about that at Com Network Local. And for now, as you can tell, we're doing this all over Zoom, all these beautiful faces of folks, your colleagues and friends, many of them. Mr. T, if you'll take us forward. A couple pieces of housekeeping here. One, all of these events are coming up and they are available. Probably makes sense to show up if they're in your backyard, but everybody is welcome. So coming up just next week, we'll have our friends in Detroit gathering to talk a little bit more about the work we're going to talk about today, DEI work. Jess Setzman and the team from the Com Network DC group is going to be gathering March 3rd. You might have gotten that in your inbox if you're part of our DC local community. And then out there in Seattle a little bit later into March, you'll see a conversation is going to happen around vaccinations and COVID-19. All good, great stuff, and a really welcome, warm place to go to find other folks who are working in the space that you are. Mr. T, if you'll take us forward. I also get to say, excuse me, gang, get to say thank you to a few folks. So some of our leaders transition off. That just makes sense. It's a lot to constantly organize and bring together these communities. And so just a huge note of thanks to our friends Ann, Lyda, and Tennille for their service, Lyda and Ann in DC, and Tennille stepping away from her role with Com Network Los Angeles, but grateful to all of them for their leadership. And just especially over this last year with all the challenges, they've continued to show up not only for us, but for all of you. And so really grateful to them. I want to welcome some folks. Mr. T, if you'll take us forward. So two new folks. Lindsay's down there in Texas and has obviously been going through quite a lot. So we're grateful for her for stepping forward. And our friend Emily has stepped into the leadership role, or one of the leadership roles with the DC group. So we want to welcome her as well. All right, I think that is the last of my housekeeping pieces before we get underway. One last thing, maybe just a flag for y'all. As you can see, Kenya was on the screen there. She's going to be providing ASL services for us for this hour, and our friend Alan is providing closed captioning. If you should need that closed captioning, you can find that down at the bottom of the screen. Just says that CC logo. Click that open. You'll be able to follow along. And then finally, we're going to take some questions along the way before I hand this off to Niiobli. Just want to let you all know, questions, I'm going to be moderating those. I will look in the Q&A box, and it's easy to find. It says Q and the ampersand A. Put your questions there. You can also vote for questions so that we make sure we get to the questions that are most relevant to the most folks. All right, so with that, a lot of folks in the room with us today, so to bear with us, we're going to try to get to as many of these questions as we possibly can. But why don't I stop yakking at you and hand this off to my friends Niiobli and Samia, who I've had the great good fortune and pleasure to get to know and to get to work alongside over the last couple of years. They're now going to spend the next hour with us talking about some of the work we've been doing together and how it might be helpful to all of you. Grateful for you all being with us. I'll see you in a little bit. Niiobli and Samia, why don't y'all take it away?
Great, thank you so much, Sean. Hello, everybody. My name is Samia Mirza with We-Collab.
And I'm Niiobli, Armah with We-Collab.
We're very excited to be here to talk to you all about the Communicator's role in racial equity work, and also really talk through the Com Network DEI.org resource as well. So let's get started here. If we could flip to the next slide. So as we began this project, as a team, we started from a place of acknowledging that communicators have a power of storytelling and shaping the narrative of people, of communities, of situations, of identities. These narratives have the power to influence our biases, our perceptions, and our opinions, all of which lead to how people are treated. What policies are put into place, who gets a promotion, who gets to graduate, who gets killed by the police, who gets to eat, who gets to have clean water, and the list goes on. It may sound like an exaggeration, but the fact is that our systems are built on perceived values based on various identities. And so no, we don't think that it's an exaggeration. We believe that communicators have a huge role in racial equity work. And today we want to tell you what we believe your role is and walk through the resources that we've been able to bring together to support your efforts. So on today's agenda, we're going to talk about the project background and process. We'll talk about the role of the communicator. We'll walk through the Com Network DEI.org website. And then we'll do a deep dive into one of the tools if we have some time as well. And of course, we're going to take your questions and hear from you all as well. Next slide.
So I want to start off and just give some background about how we got here. Super grateful to Sean and the team that assembled this project. I think the most important thing to call out is that we did this project in community with a number of stakeholders. So I want to give a shout out to the Communications Network DEI work group, M&R strategies, and We-Collab really worked together to think through the problem and develop the report and the content and the tools. Gray Mercy Research Group was brought together to conduct research and do a scan of the field and talk to many of you. So thank you all for engaging with us, to those of you who are able to. And Proper and Henry No were brought together to design and develop the website. And so it's really important to call out that we developed this tool being in community with different diverse voices. That's just a preview of what's to come. Next slide, please. So the question we sought out to answer was, what tools do communicators need to advance racial diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations and more broadly? We wanted to know what tools and resources you need, what existed in the field, what gaps were there. And we wanted to have a deep discussion about anti-Blackness. Now, at the beginning of this project, there was dialogue about how diversity, equity, and inclusion are fundamental issues, but what are we going to anchor on? And we chose, of all those things, to anchor on race, not just because the moment we're living in, because you could argue we've always lived in this moment, but we chose to anchor on it because that's where people get stuck. That's where people are handicapped. That's where people get paralyzed. And so I want you to brace yourself, because today we're going to have a bias towards action, and you should leave this webinar feeling challenged, but you should also leave it feeling like you have tools to help you.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. So we want to talk through a bit about the process that we took in developing this resource and our thought process here. So we conducted an environmental scan where we were really looking to see what exists out there around DEI for communicators specifically. So not about DEI as a concept or diversity, equity, and inclusion as a concept, but what are the resources, guides, research, articles, best thinking around the communications of these concepts. So we conducted this environmental scan. We also conducted a survey of the network membership. So the survey went out to all of you as a member and the various organizations. We received about 146 responses from all different sizes of organizations and also different levels in the organization. So from comms shop, as well as the leadership of organizations as well. Next, we conducted key informant interviews. Again, it was a diverse cadre of folks, from large foundations to community nonprofits, to single person communications groups, to a large communications team. So we really wanted to understand, like, what are the roadblocks when it comes to communications for DEI, racial DEI? What are the roadblocks? What has worked? What are different examples that you all use? And then the last was, we really wanted to aggregate all of the existing resources. So we really looked at guides, we looked at presentations, et cetera, to understand what resources exist, where is the gap, and then what can we develop to bring those resources together for you all. Next slide, please.
So after speaking with you all, here's a little bit about what we learned at the beginning of the process. So about 43% said their organizations did not have a clearly defined DEI value or goal. About 56% said that DEI was not an explicit component of their organization's communication strategy. And about 58% said they feel that they do not have a strong understanding of DEI concepts. So what this means is, overall, about half of the organizations we looked at didn't have an explicit focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in their comm strategies. It doesn't mean that folks aren't thinking about it or it's not top of mind, but there's not an explicit carve out or space or container for the work that needs to happen as we unpack not just anti-Black issues, but across the board. Next slide, please.
Yeah, there are other 4 key findings that we were able to pull through all of the research that we did. There were many findings, but these ones really rose to the top. So the first one was that the role of racism was mostly absent from available DEI resources for communicators. So not to say that the role of racism isn't present in DEI concepts as a whole, but when it came to communications tools, it really wasn't available. there wasn't explicit mention of it, and there wasn't explicit development of tools with that lens. The second finding was that organizations have different definitions of DEI, and that many communicators don't clearly know what these concepts are. And so the different definitions really kind of range from very kind of simplistic definitions to going much deeper. It's not that they were all different. So the definition of diversity wasn't different, but they each had different components of the lens that they were looking through and how they were deconstructing the concept. The third was that multicultural messaging promotes diversity, but that research also showed that some people don't see themselves reflected in the message. So when we're looking at colorblind messaging, for example, we are all equal, we are all important, we are all valued, versus multicultural messaging that we are all diverse and equal, or we are all diverse and have value in our diversity. There's, value in Blackness, there's value in whiteness, there's value in, all of the different diverse spectrum there. But what we found was that not everyone was able to see themselves in that multicultural frame. And so folks tended to go on the safer side of using colorblind frame instead. And then the fourth was that there's a lack of data and metrics on effective racial equity communications. And this is a serious information gap, meaning there was a lot of message testing and word testing, phrase testing, when it came to, what resonates with Democrats versus Republicans, or what resonates with left versus right, or rural versus urban. But there wasn't a lot of data or information about how do we change biases, or when we use these phrases and words, how did it shift the way somebody saw or interpreted the different races? So there's a lack of data when it comes to that. Now, we took all of our information and everything that we found, lots of conversations later and a lot of kind of wrestling back and forth as a team. We came to this product of the Com Network DEI website. And what this website really is it's an accumulation of all of the resources that we found. And it's a way of looking at this topic specifically from the lens of race, and specifically tangible, actionable ways that you as a communicator can really embody it and bring it into your work. We're going to go much more into detail about the actual website, but before that, we're going to talk more about your role in the equity work itself.
So before we move on, Sean, I didn't know if you were trying to get in, but I want to invite you into the discussion.
No, why don't you guys go ahead? We have a lot of folks in the room here, and I know we have a lot to cover. We'll take some questions along the way. Is that what you want to pause for, questions, or should we go ahead?
No, we're going to do questions at the end of this next section. I saw you leaning in, so I was
what? I'm just blind. I've got to use my specs in order to see the
All
comments.
good.
Thank you for being thoughtful.
Of course. Tristan, let's go to the next slide. And I really want to just pause and anchor here for a moment. Often, when it comes to racial equity issues, we don't want anyone in the network to think that you aren't the catalyst for change for this. And this is what Samia started to get at. This webinar would be very, very different if we were talking to program staff or the C-suite. But when it comes to what your role is, we want to evolve the thinking, the ability, the access to tools so that you have a bias towards action. And so the next section of this webinar is us spending a little bit of time really unpacking what your specific and unique role can be. Lots of the tools are going to be complementary to this next section, and so you can go back and reference them. But there's about 3 overarching roles that laser focus on your profession, your expertise, and your skills. So let's go to the next slide. So the first role that communicators can play in this is the voice of leadership. So what do I mean when I say the voice of leadership? You often have a different relationship with the leadership of your organization or foundation than anyone else does. You help craft their voice to the field. You help develop their messages. And so often you are the person that's most proximate to any of the content that's going to come from them. So if we live in a world where the majority of foundation leaders are white, we actually have to have communication professionals who are equipped in resources to give them the tools they need. And so you see two examples here of Melinda Gates or Grant from the Heinz Foundation, where obviously not just them as leaders in the field of philanthropy, but their comms team equipped them to inject content in the middle of a national crisis that was relevant and that was on message. And everyone's not going to get it right, but the point that we want to like laser focus in on here is that you're proximate. And if you push a little, if you're a little bit more suggestive, then maybe leaders will be more bold in talking about these issues. And so the next question you could have is like, well, what are the tips to do that? Like, how do I actually, where does that start? And so let's go to the next slide. And Trisha, you can go ahead and just tick through all these. So I just want to pause for a moment, because you have examples in the field that we can look to. You have the Darren Walkers of the world. You have, I mentioned Grant from the Heinz Foundation. So we have examples of how foundation leaders are using their voice. And I think one of the points I started to make that I want to double down on is that you don't have to be a person of color to talk about racism. And so we have to give space and agency for people of color, Black, Latino, to have a seat at the table, but it doesn't mean that that's a get out of jail free card to where you're not doubling down on what they're saying. And so this whole idea about crafting leadership is about making sure that everyone in the organization is connected in a way where there is a voice for this. And the catalyst for that voice can be the communications professionals. I think another important point here is to acknowledge the privilege and power of the thought leader. So we're living in a moment where at the end of last year, after the murder of George Floyd, the corporate sector donated multi-million dollars to the issue of racial equity. Now, we know some of that is for moral reasons, but if we're really, really, really honest and blunt and candid, which I hope we could be with this network, once folks saw what other foundations were doing, once they read the press release, once they saw the announcement, folks ran into the boardroom to figure out what's our stance? Where are we going to double down? And so again, the question is, were the communication professionals equipped and positioned in a way with others in their foundations to get their leaders to not only just make bold commitments, but to actually double down on those commitments? And often you think this work needs to start in the board or it needs to start on the program staff. I think what we're unequivocally saying is that it can actually start with you.
Yeah, I actually want to jump in and point out another point on this slide here is around being aware that others model your behavior. So when the leader of your organization is making a speech or writing a statement or even social media, it's a cue to the field about how we're supposed to be talking about the topic, what words we're supposed to be using, what is a priority. And so as you're crafting these messages, really, really being aware that it's not just a representation of your organization or the views of your organization, but it's also a resource almost, or a model that you're providing to the field of how we're supposed to be showing up in this space and how we're supposed to be talking, whether it's the words you're using or the images you're using. These are all cues to folks on how they're supposed to also be modeling their communications.
No, I think that's an important point, Samia, because as practitioners, as someone who's worked on grassroots issues, who has spent more than 15 years in the community, I often hear in meetings like folks saying, we got to center the community, we got to center the community. I 100% agree with that. But here's the punchline. No one in community is like, I don't know any grassroots leaders that may or may not be on this webinar right now. And so let me push that even further what I'm saying. When we're crafting message for nonprofit leaders and for foundation leaders, the person hearing that message is more often than not another foundation leader. People who are actively embedded in organizing and principles. Right now, all the organizers I know in Texas right now are trying to make sure that people without power, people without lights have access to food and water. They're not on this webinar. So you should center the community in your content. But the audience you need to think about is, how do I get that other foundation to read what I'm saying, internalize it, and then double down on the commitment so that the community is the beneficiary. And I just think that's really, really important, that we sometimes we make messages and tweets and speeches for the end user, but quite often the end users are not plugged into our networks. We're usually talking to each other. And so we need to be thoughtful that it's not like, what does the community want to hear my foundation president say? The community wants your foundation to commit more money. So what are the other foundations going to hear you say that gets more resources to the community? That's really, really important. Center community, but don't think about the action that you influence for your other peers in this space. Let's go to the next slide. So another role of communicators, I mean, you all are storytellers. We're definitely not gonna 100% tell you how to do your jobs, because this is a two-way street. But we're in a moment where narrative change is so important. Everyone's always talking about narrative change. But before narrative change is the output of something, what we don't talk enough about is shifting the mental model. So if you shift the mental model, then narrative change is the outcome of that. So a mental model is an explanation of thought process about how something works in the real world. So there's a science behind how our minds formulate biases and perspectives and what we see and what we hear and what we experience. So the goal of the role of the communicator is to ensure that any messaging that's coming from your organization is strong enough to shift the mental model about what someone has about a specific population. And because this project was rooted in anti-Blackness, we know if we shift the mental models there, and we're going to have beneficiaries in other areas. And so let's take, for example, this whole idea of how we talk about young people in this country. And even in this day and age, we still talk about at risk. So first and foremost, like, who wants to be called at risk? Like, regardless of circumstance, not me, not you,
Not me.
definitely not Samia, definitely not the vigilant young people in our country who have been on the front lines for this racial injustice. And so the problem is that we made a claim on students before we even got a chance to fully understand what they need. And so it makes at-risk as a category almost like it's an honor roll, when we could just quite honestly say student. And so let me go a little deeper in this. And so Travian Shorters, with his asset-based framing, he's a friend of the network. We're students of his work. You know, and when you think about the importance of that work, it's not just so that we talk about communities for the aspirations that they want to achieve. That's the goal of that work. What's really important is that we don't add more stigma that's already on communities. And so you could just say students in this neighborhood or students in this geographic part of the country, but we don't have to keep labeling folks with judgments before we talk about them. This is important for the communications professional because you all help package and solidify causes and issues. So if you don't internalize, you know, asset framing versus deficit framing, if you don't internalize naming the aspiration before the population, then we're never going to see a shift in narrative change. Like, this is single-handedly one of the most important things that communicators can do, is be agents of change and shifting mental models that help us get to racial equity that's more fully realized. But Samia, you definitely jump in here because we have a lot that we can say on this one point.
Yeah, I want to add to the at-risk student part of it. So there's two kind of different shifts that we're making. We're shifting how we're defining the student and the label where we're assigning to them, but we're also shifting where we're assigning responsibility. So at-risk student implies that the student has done something to make themselves at risk, right? It's their responsibility that they're at risk, versus if we just call them a student and then choose to describe the circumstances or the situation, and we can, you know, choose to say because of policies, because of certain, you know, circumstances in the neighborhood, and define what those attributes are that the student finds themselves in. We're now also shifting the mental model of where the responsibility lies. It's not on the student, it's on the system or the circumstance that the student then finds themselves in. The second one that we wanted to talk about is around the unarmed Black man phrase here. So this is a term that has been very kind of commonly used as a lot of the videos of police brutality have been surfacing. And it's really become this phrase to denote innocence, right? Well, he was an unarmed Black man, so therefore he was innocent. And so it's used in a way to really kind of support the victim, right, in their innocence. But what the study found is that instead what it's doing is it's assigning that we need to first ask the question, was he unarmed or not? Like there's an assumption that he may not have been unarmed. And then there's also an assumption that if he was armed, then he was not innocent, right? Then he must have been guilty, which gun rights, we know that's not the case either, right? And so the study found that in the last year since Ahmaud Arbery's death, which this week is a year since his death, NPR mentioned the phrase unarmed Black man 82 times. And in that same time frame, not once did they mention unarmed white man. Right? So let that sit 82 times in the year and not once unarmed white man. And so again, that creates these associations in our mind of when we think of a Black man that has been killed, that was he unarmed, was he not? Was he innocent? And we have to ask that question. So mental model shifts are about breaking these associations and really challenging how we are further defining and reinforcing stereotypes. Whew.
So
right,
we're getting a lot of questions about this. And so I'm going to answer one question and then we should probably move on, but let's stay on shifting mental models. So there was a question about whether grants often label them at risk, like that's in the language, it's low income community. And so I think the challenge that we have is, you know, we definitely should change grant language, but when it comes to messaging the work we do in the community, even if the grant says this work is happening in a low income community, low income is not the only descriptor of that community. Maybe it's a historic community. Maybe there used to be civil rights leaders from that community. And so the messaging around it can say, you know, for the work that we're doing in Houston, Texas, you know, in the third ward, and then you name some asset-based framing about the third ward. It's a resilient community. In spite of that, here's what the data says. So that the data can just say what the data says, but you don't have to call it a low-income community. You can use an asset-based frame to name the place where the work is happening. Use the data to say, here are the circumstances in which people are living under, which is the circumstances in which people are living under is very different than calling them low income. Like here's the average medium household income. Like that's a fact versus saying these are low income people. And so you have to use data. We have to get more sophisticated. I definitely hear the point about it's what it says in the grant agreement. I would argue that as a comms person, you can help shift some of the language in a grants agreement. You can walk to the table with a different framing to show how you talk about the work on top of that. And so just a few other points here.
Niiobli, can I jump in really quick on that point?
Yeah, absolutely.
As a foundation, it's important for you to think about the language in your grant agreement, because then that is what organizations end up having to use that language as well, right? Unless they're able to break that, as Niiobli said, and use different terminology. As a nonprofit that is receiving a grant, it is also your responsibility to manage up a little bit and let them know, hey, that's not how we define our communities. I know in the grant agreement, this is what it says, but that's not how we define it. This is how we define it. And perhaps we should have a conversation about, you know, changing that definition writ large for your grants. And so I think that there's a way to push back on the terminology. If you know better, then help others know better as well.
Yeah. And I think the last point that we want to make here, sorry, you all are very, very engaged. And so I'm like looking at the comments. You know, when you talk about how we describe communities, there's a ton of place-based work happening across the country right now. We know because of development trends that any corridor of the country you could be in, there's a historic name for the neighborhood and there's the new name for the neighborhood, you know, based off recent development trends. Even just doing a little bit more history or fact finding, you know, if your leader is going to be in a community, he can say, hey, they may call this the museum district, but X foundation or X organization, we know this is the third ward. And let me tell you some assets about the community of third ward. You're resilient, you know, and we often, you know, social justice, racial justice advocates use the word authenticity. I actually want to like demystify what authenticity means. Authenticity means that no matter who you're talking to, they know that you've done some homework before you've entered space with them and you're not talking at them. And the best way to do that is to like find out what are the assets of that community? What is the historical notion of that place? We know public policy has changed place over time. The people in the community didn't make it a low-income community. They didn't take away the grocery stores. That's the result of public policy. So we have to meet the people halfway there in showing that we understand the impact that's had. And I think this is a disconnect that's happening in racial justice work, is that we're not acknowledging the historic legacy that got us to a moment why we live in a society where anti-Blackness is so relevant. We have to acknowledge that history in our communications as we move through. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. So this is the last of 3 points, and then we're definitely going to shift gears and talk more about the website, but I'm pretty sure this is not going to be our last time talking to you. So, and after this, we'll definitely take some more questions as well. So the whole idea of shaping your organization's network. So we started off by talking about how you use leadership and voice, because of your relationship with the leaders in the organization, how you prepare them. Then we talked about the language that gets people attracted or detracted and how we can shift there. This last point is about the network. And when I say network, in all aspects of the network. And so in order to make meaningful equity impact, like nonprofits and foundations are going to have to change who's included in the work. Like, who do we resource in this effort to change racial justice in this country? And who you resource is going to range from the subcontractor. So who are the vendors that are most likely connected to you to put into a place to do this work? But then there's the other aspect of this: who sees themselves in your work? And so let's take, for example, and I'm sorry, one of the other panelists may need to go on mute. I'm getting a little bit of background. So who sees themselves in your work? And so let's hypothetically say the grants team has decided to say, we want a more diverse grantee pool. Like, great. We want more diverse grantees. A grant manager has decided that, and they're emailing folks out to the network. If I'm a potential grantee, if I never meet the grant manager, I don't know they want a diverse pool. But if I go to your website and I don't see myself in your work, then I'm never gonna, it doesn't matter how much the grant teams wants to diversify the pool. If the work hasn't been done from the digital team to the comms team to the outreach team, if I go to your social feed and I don't see the language or the words that identify with me, then I'm never gonna put myself in that in group. And we know foundations and nonprofit organizations are very insular, but we know to get to the racial change work, and they have to be more outwardly focused and bring more folks along. That's the inclusion part of DEI. Then we have to change who's attracted to us. And that's what this is about. It's about using communications to have diverse folks on our website, to have diverse language, to have new vendors and subcontractors that are proximate to the work that we could bring in and resource them appropriately. Let's go to the next slide, just for the sake of time. So we want you to be thoughtful about your website, the imagery, the language, the content. We want you to be thoughtful about how you write job descriptions. What are the skills that you're looking for? Who are you linked to get those into new networks, to get more diverse professionals in the field? And then prioritize the knowledge and lived experience. Like there is a specific quantifiable outcome from having someone in the room who has lived through the changes that your organization says it wants to see in the world. Like, you can quantify that. Like, being proximate is not a term in allegory. If you want to change outcomes, you should engage people who have lived through those outcomes. Or if you want to impact an issue or a neighborhood, you should engage people who have been in that issue in that neighborhood. And so this whole idea about prioritizing equity, knowledge, and lived experience, it's a competency that's not going to go away. It doesn't matter how uncomfortable you are. It doesn't matter how many tools you say you don't have access to and your board is still thinking about it. Like, the check is signed, sealed, and delivered. This is the country we're living in. And so we are going to have to professionalize, train, and teach. Like, this lived experience that Black and brown people have, like, our white brothers and sisters are going to have to understand it and engage with it, because we're all in this country together. And so we can't keep writing off lived experience, or, we have to figure out, like, how do we professionalize that in a way that honors people through dignity. And so I'm going to stop going on a random tangent, but let's pause. Let's go to the next slide, and let's just check in on some questions.
So we have a number of questions. I'm going to start with Sarah's, because it captures some of the questions that that Caroline had. Sarah asks, I've been committed to removing deficit framing from our org's writing this year, but I always run into obstacles in talking about students' family income levels, which drives decisions on our scholarships, discounts, as well as many other funders' priorities. Do you have any recommendations for how to communicate about low-income households or communities impacted by divestment in a non-deficit framing model?
Wow, great question. Okay, I want to answer this and not go off on another tangent. There are so many other ways to better understand what's happening in the community without just looking at income. If you look at Andre Perry's work from the Brookings Foundation, he talks about the devaluation of Black homes, how the Black home as an asset is devalued more. Wealth is another indicator that tells way more than just income, because income is focused on employment. There's other financial assets and debts involved, which a wealth perspective will tell you more. An example would be if you're working on, let's take, for example, student debt alleviation. Just looking at income is not going to tell you much. Income is just going to tell you what they make. But if you look at the total financial asset portfolio, you're going to not just say, like, tell me how much income you make, tell me how much student debt you have. Tell me what other assets or collateral you have so that the public policy solution solves more than a singular issue. So long story short, income is not the only predictor of what happens in people's lives. I think there's an old way, a traditional way of looking through a statistical framework. There's other data and metrics that should be part of the conversation that you can use to describe what's happening with that population you want to serve.
I just jump in really quick. For those that do have to use income, if that's like built into your model and you do have to use it, you can actually just use the data or the statistic, right? So families under the income level of $50,000 per household versus low income. It uses more words, but you're instead of just labeling them low income, you're actually defining what low income even is, right? Low income can mean a lot of different things. And I think there's obviously a government definition of it, but not everybody knows that. And so just using the actual statistic instead of the label can also be helpful.
Okay, next question coming in. I'll just remind you, when we talk about low income, this is not the way we, there was a couple questions in here about underrepresented, underserved, and a question about whether these are deficit frames. The answer is yes. If you're starting with something about what someone is missing, that is a deficit frame. There are other ways to approach your communications that are a little bit more aspirational. And I'm glad for these questions, gang. We're all in the problem solving business. This is a problem our field is facing. Next question comes from someone who is anonymous. Says, I work at a community foundation where we prioritize trust-based grant making for BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations. And, sorry, jumped up here. And we centralize our storytelling about the impact of these nonprofit partners. That said, our donor base is like literally 100% white. We also do donor profiles to inspire more giving. How do we move beyond the inherently paternalistic messaging of white money funding BIPOC programs and services?
Sean, say the last part again, just the last part.
How do we move beyond the inherently paternalistic messaging of white money funding BIPOC programs and services?
Okay, so that's a weighted question. So I'm not going to go on a tangent, but I think I have a few things. And so we have to understand, quite honestly, the source of white money. And we know that many foundations in our country, there's some organizations that are starting to talk about this, tell you about where their money came from. And guess what? It's not white money. A lot of white money was built on the backs of Black and brown people. And so if we're honest in the source of philanthropic dollars, and if we really understand how foundations work, the American Medical Association has done the research and they've came out and apologized about all the health disparities they did. And we wouldn't have these solutions to health disparity issues if it wasn't for the research that was done on Black women without sedatives. And so it's not white money. We have to be honest in talking about where the money came from, follow the data. We're just giving a return on investment. We're just doubling down. Foundations should triple what they're doing, because particularly if it's a corporate foundation. And so this is not a political statement. This is fact-based. Like, the information is there. And so, and this is where in communication space, we could get confused because we label things based off what folks in our network call it, but if we would open up our network a little bit more, we would understand that like, oh, there's tons of research out there about the origins of these money. And so I don't want to go on a tangent, but in a short story, I think we have to take a step back and acknowledge the source of wealth in this country. And there would be no wealth in this country without Black or brown people. And if we look at if we get rid of racial inequity, we would have much more wealth. And so you can look backwards and get the answer to that question, or you could look forward. But the way that we understand this is just, I think data is really important, but you have to label that in with messaging. So I said I wasn't going to go on a tangent. So let's go to the next question.
All right, let's do one more question. I know we want to move through some of the other tools, so we'll make time for that. We'll come back and do more questions at the end, gang. Last question comes from Martha, Niiobli, and Samia. Get ready. This is something we had talked about. How do we do communications work effectively and bring these new ideas into our work without asking BIPOC communication staff to have to effectively be racial equity and racism scanners for programmatic work and researchers? So many of us are writing the anti-racism personas of our leadership and organization at great cost to BIPOC communications folks. How do we make this equitable and ethical if we can?
Samia, you could definitely jump in. I think I can tell you what we shouldn't do, and then we have answers about what you can do. What you should not do is walk away from this webinar feeling very, very empowered and then run back to your organization and say, hey, Black person, I just was on a webinar and I need to get you in the network, so go. Every Black person who works on social justice foundation nonprofit issues doesn't necessarily want to tell their lived experience so it can go on the poster. And so first and foremost, let's just treat people with dignity and acknowledge that all of our colleagues don't necessarily have to give all of themselves in order for our organizations to grow. I think the other thing, and this is some of the other work we've been doing with organizations, is that we've recently been taking an organization through some equity training. And the organizations understand externally what they need to do to change policy and practice. They haven't internalized how they need to treat their colleagues, particularly Black and brown, on how to get there. And so we know the part of our brain that acknowledges history is different than the part of our brain that's used to actually make behavior change. So you can simultaneously understand these issues and process them and do absolutely nothing different in your job. And that's where the disconnect is. So if you're on the equity continuum and you've done the internal work, then you should ask yourself, where have I caused harm? How am I approaching my colleagues? How am I approaching other people in the space? And then how do I become bold enough to have that frank conversation to make sure that what I'm doing is additive and not retractive? There's a longer answer there, but Samia, I didn't know if you were trying to jump in on this question as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that a couple of kind of tactical things of how to avoid always depending on your Black colleagues or your people of color colleagues is one, create your own awareness, right? The more books you read, podcasts, videos, just the more you listen and hear, you're going to better understand what is okay to say and what's not okay to say, right? So one, increase your own awareness, and we're going to talk through the website to help you with that. The second is going to be, that's what partnerships are for and what your vendors are for as well, right? So hire the right consultants and vendors that can be that spot check for you. It doesn't have to be your Black colleague, right? They have their own job. They can't always come in and do a review for you and do a scan for you. Hire people, right? Like hire consultants, make sure that the vendors that you hire, this kind of goes back to what we talked about of the competencies that you're hiring for. Often what happens is we'll hire a white communications firm because we trust them, we know them, they have a big name, and then we'll ask them to do equity communications, but they have no people of color on their staff. And so now they have to build up their expertise in it. So instead, why not find a firm that is led by people of color that does have expertise in this? So that's another suggestion. The third would be partnerships. So depend and rely on the partnerships that you have. Build your network and create a space where you can have that back and forth with them and utilize those partnerships instead of your own staff.
Yeah. So we have 10 minutes left. I think we should transition to a quick overview of the website. Just to end this section, I just want to round off with, remember that this is about communicators. And so you all have been extremely grateful in putting organizations like frameworks in the comments that you can go to. Like, if nothing else, our only goal is for you to be more conscious of the resources and tools you have. This website is one. There's many, many others. There's tons of resources in it. And so Samia, I just think we should spend the rest of the time going deep in navigating what's in the website and understanding what's there so you can put it into practice, because you all have a lot of questions. And so we want to make sure you're equipped and tooled.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump into the website. We can actually just flip to the next slide here. So there's really 4 major sections to the site that we wanted to build out as a resource for all of you and to continue these conversations. So the first will be the report that was developed. So all of the research that I mentioned earlier, we distilled all of that down into a report that can be found on the site. What I do want to say is that this is not just a report out of statistics. It actually has a lot of guiding themes, a lot of discussion questions, so it can be used as a tool in and of itself. There's a lot of considerations that as a comms team, considerations you should be making. So I really encourage you to read that report. It's not that long. I think it's maybe 15 pages or so, but it's a great tool for you to ground your work in. Also a great tool to take to your leadership as you're trying to become a catalyst for your organization, a great tool to take to leadership as well. The next slide, we have a cadre of 9 tools for you all to pick from that are tangible tools for the type of day-to-day work that you do. So we really thought about, as a communications expert, what are some of the primary roles and products that you develop? And we wanted to provide you with tangible tips to think through for each of those. So we have 9 here. And then if you look on the bottom right corner, we also built out a glossary as well. So a lot of the terminology that's been coming up that we've been discussing and you all have been posting, we have a definition for those as well. So definitely check that out. And we'll dive into the tool section just a little bit more as we go forward. But on the next slide, we also have some case studies to give you an opportunity to learn from what others are doing in the field. Like we said, we did interview a lot of really, really great professionals and communicators. And so we wanted to make sure that you were able to learn from your peers. And so there's a variety of case studies that we have, everything from small organizations to large. There's stories about how the communications team really drove the organization's change. There's conversations about how leadership drove that change into communications. And so kind of all of the different angles of the work there. And then the last section is going to be around the resources that we have. So we wanted to provide resources beyond just the communications piece. What we found was there's so many resources out there. There's not a lack of. So we didn't want to have to create brand new resources. What we really wanted to do was pull some of the favorites that we had around one, communications for good. So these are specific resources in the field that are made for communications around DEI, some with the racial lens, but others just around DEI. There's the organizational change. So being a catalyst for your organization, we felt that it was really important for you to understand DEI from an organizational perspective as well. So what are all of the different ways an organization comes together to make that change? And then the last one is racial equity, kind of more writ large. So one of the things that we really, really firmly believed as we were building this site is that racial equity is not just a matter of a checklist. It's not just a matter of blurbs. It is really a matter of understanding, embodying the issues, and then being able to articulate that back into the field and into the world. And so what we wanted to do was really encourage you as communicators to become well-rounded. You all know your craft, you know how to communicate, you know how to, create social media posts and all of your comms work. So that's not what we're trying to teach you. What we're saying is be an expert in the issues and areas of your organization so that you as a communicator can show up with their best foot forward and really be able to articulate that message best. And in just the last slide here, we were going to go into a much deeper explanation of the tools, but what I do want to talk through is how to use those 9 tools that we have, or I guess 8 of them specifically, is these can really be used, one, as a reference point. So you're developing an internal communications, and so you can go there and you can do a quick reference of, these are 9 suggestions of things that I need to consider, right? So let me pull through and make sure I made these considerations. The second way you can utilize that same tool is as a discussion tool. So within your teams or your organizations, you can really say, well, you know, these are 8 tips that they've provided on internal communications. What are we doing so far? How does this connect back to our work? What do we need to change in our organization to be able to communicate internally in this way? The third is an assessment, and I use that term very loosely. These are not like rigorous assessments, but what you can say is, if these are 9 tips that they've given us, where do we fall? How many of these are we actually doing right now? Okay, great, we're doing 2 of them. What plan can we create to be able to incorporate these other into our day-to-day work or teams? And then the last is the catalyst for org change. And I think that you've heard us say that a lot, because we really do believe in the power of communications to be that catalyst. So using these tools to have conversations with leadership to say, hey, we want to be talking about these issues in this way, but that has an implication in the way that we then grant, or that has an implication in the way that we partner with organizations. And so it really becomes, because we're talking about it in this way, forcing us to change how we act and do and show up to make that in line with each other. So that's the website. We really hope that you all go use it, give us feedback. We'd love to hear from all of you. And we're going to be hoping to evolve this as we go on in time, but really excited for y'all to be able to dive into it. Sean, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thank you, Samia. So we were going to take up some time here. We've run out of time. Do we want to make a moment for just one question as we go out the door? Is that all right with you all? Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So let's see if we can jump up here to the top. Gang, if you're looking, I am looking in the Q&A box. So I'm looking for who's voted for the top question. Let's see here. Carrie has a good one. Let's put it in here. How do we strike the balance between taking a bold stand on anti-racism issues while acknowledging that our organization is in the early stages of this work, in this listening, learning stage? I want to ensure we approach it with humility while being unequivocal. I can't speak today, gang. Unequivocal in our commitment. So how do we own the fact that many of us are still very much in a learning stage? We want to be in the right place, but we don't want to be presumptuous and suggest we've done all the work if we haven't quite gotten there. Any suggestions?
I think I couldn't stand when teachers used to tell me this, but I think the answer to your question was in your question. You do exactly that. We don't understand all the issues. We're gonna mess up. We're probably ill-equipped, but we're trying. And the reason why we're trying is because this is the issue of our time, and history isn't gonna be kind to us. And so in effort of getting ahead of this, we're going to dig deep, we're going to learn, we're going to open up our doors, but we're going to try and try and try, because that's what the moment requires. Be extremely honest about where you're at. When people overnight went and made commitments to racial equity and wrote soliloquies on things they had never done, folks knew who they were and they got talked about really, really bad. So the best thing to do is to be honest about where you are. Talk about you. We talked about asset-based framing. What are your aspirations for this work? Where do you want to go? And then be a little bit provocative and say, hey, we're open to pushback. Like, invite it. Like, that's the only way to handle this work, is to face it head on. If you try to hide or, like use it, like we're trying, or you show images of all the things that you can went back and recategorize as racial equity work, that's not sufficient. Just be honest.
I think that is probably the place that we need to leave it. Honesty and kindness are incredibly important tools. So with that, let me just say thank you for the kindness from Niiobli and Samia for making the time. We'll be back again because this is a conversation that needs to continue. We didn't solve it in an hour, as you all can well tell. But thank you to both of them. They'll be back with us, and also to Kenya and to Alan for providing us some accessibility services, that ASL interpretation from Kenya and the CART services from Alan. So thank you to both of them. Gang, we will be back. We have a webinar coming up, I think, early next month about how to write emails. Chances are you already know this, but your emails are all too long. So we're going to talk about that together. And then Samia and Niiobli will be back. And several of our local groups have been hosting conversations on this tool. So if you want to go a little bit deeper and have a chance to discuss it with colleagues, that may be a good place to look. Detroit doing a conversation just like that early next week. So with that, I'm going to let everybody go. Be safe and well. We'll talk to you all soon. Grateful to everybody for showing up. This was our largest webinar ever. If that tells you any indication that folks are clearly keen to learn and get a little bit better, and we're joining you on that journey. So expect more from us and hold us accountable. Thanks, everybody. Be safe and well. Cheers.